We're going to continue with Chapter 11, and we're going to be talking about some selected cultures who represent kind of major trading partners in the United States and differences in business management and business etiquette in those cultures. We're going to start with talking about Japan, and we're going to look at a short video about business cards, which is an important part of Japanese business culture.
はじめまして。はじめまして。よろしくお願いいたします。お願いいたします。
Please take a close look at the angles that these men are bowing at. Now, this is the right way to bow. And this is the wrong way to bow. And take a look at the importance of the angle of the feet. Now let's take a look at some of the finer details of where you're actually supposed to hold the card.
よろしくお願いいたします。名刺を渡すときは
When you exchange business cards in Japan, it's important to hold the corner of the business card and not cover your company logo or your own name with your thumb. This is considered bad manners in Japan. You must remember to hold the corner of the business card.
名刺を受け取るときは片手で受け取る。
When you receive a business card, it's important to hold it with both hands and holding it over your meishi case. You should never, ever put away your business card quickly and put it away in your pockets. You must display respect by holding it over your meishi case.
Let's take a final view of how to exchange business cards right.
はじめまして。はじめまして。お願いいたします。お願いします。お願いいたします。
Now you can get in line and try to get a job in Japan like the rest of us.
A couple of things of interest there. One is that there's a very established set ritual for exchanging business cards and how you hand that to your partner, how you receive it. One of the things that's not mentioned there is that business cards in Japan and other Asian countries and countries, in fact, across the world, often have two sides, one in the native language, so in Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, and the other in English. And one of the things that's important there in terms of the business card is getting the name of the person right. For example, in Japan and China, typically the family name is given first, and then that's followed by the first name. And so sometimes that's confusing for Westerners. And sometimes in Japan, what they do is they put the family name in all caps. But getting the name right can be kind of a tricky thing, and that's one of the roles that business cards play. Is that on the English side, it makes it very clear what the name of the person is, and the ritual with business cards kind of typical of the formality of Japanese culture. You have the bowing as well, and a lot of other rituals associated with everyday life in Japan. This clashes with American kind of preference for informality and for spontaneity. Very different than Japanese culture, and obviously Japanese business culture is a reflection of Japanese culture as a whole. And one of those things that's typical of Japanese culture is the difference in terms of nonverbal and verbal language, the importance of silence. That's something that if you're doing business in Japan or in Asia generally, you'd have to get used to, is that silence doesn't necessarily mean that the person is agreeing with you. Sometimes, in fact, even the person saying yes in Chinese, hi, which is literally yes, doesn't necessarily mean yes. You may mean I'm hearing you, I understand what you're saying. One of the things that's different in Japan in terms of business culture is a strong sense of corporate social responsibility, and you see this when things go wrong in Japanese companies. So, for example, when there's a recall of of vehicles, the responsible thing to do is to apologize, and Japanese executives do that. It used to be that sometimes Japanese executives went even further and out of a sense of shame committed suicide. But certainly what you see these days is companies apologizing with deep bows at press conferences. That's what Sony did after the debacle with the, s- the names and passwords from the game consoles being hacked. That's very important in Japanese culture. This sense of social responsibilities that companies have. Um, Japanese management practices tend to be very different than they are in the United States. This seems like it would be a no-brainer business decisions based on benefit to company and employees. Well, of course. Well, it's not, of course, in American corporate culture always. Sometimes in fact, often what's most important is the benefit to the shareholders if it's a publicly held company. And what do shareholders care about? They care about profit and continual growth of the company. So it's not necessarily that the main thing for the company is what's good for the employees. The other thing that's traditional has changed somewhat, though, in recent years is this idea of lifetime employment, that you stay with a company, you have loyalty to that company, and the company is going to do the right thing by you. This, because of the financial, the economic downturn worldwide, this is something that's no longer universally the case. That when you get a job with a Japanese company, you can be assured that you're going to stay, that you'll be able to stay for as long as you want, for your entire working life, if that's what you want. One of the things that are also traditional in Japanese culture that's changing somewhat as well is the importance of seniority and that the strong hierarchy, which is typical of collectivistic cultures like Japan. We're going to watch a short clip from a film that kind of illustrates the importance of one aspect of Japanese business culture, namely exercises, and we'll talk about that. That clip is from the movie Gung Ho. It's made in the 80s when there was a lot of interest in Japanese management practices because it was perceived that Japan had a lot of advantages over the United States. This is a time when Japanese vehicles and Japanese consumer goods, the Sony Walkman, for example, other consumer goods were becoming very popular in the United States, and so there was a lot of interest in Japanese business culture. Then there was a perception, well, wow, they do things way different over there than we do. Maybe we should learn a little bit about that. So this film kind of pokes fun at that. It's about a Japanese company taking over a U.S. auto factory, and this is a first day of that. And one of the things you see there is that, and this is really the case, that Japanese companies, when they set up business abroad, they expect to use Japanese business practices, Japanese business etiquette, for example. And one of the things that's important there is exercising together. This is important because companies are paternalistic. They care about the health of employees as a real business reason for that as well. But it's also part of this idea that they want to build a strong sense of group coherence, a team spirit, and so that's why you see the executives joining in the exercise as well. The goal is don't just think of doing your job on the assembly line. Think of what's good for the company. So if you spot problems in a product as it's being developed, even if it's not in your area, you should let the company know. This is kind of different than maybe an attitude that you see often in American factories. I'll just do my job and I get paid for it, and that's all that concerns me. So what's encouraged in Japanese companies is you think of what's good for the company, and you watch out for the welfare of the company, and what that means is you want to make good products. Well, we're going to move on to Germany. Very, very different culture from Japan in a lot of ways, a more individualistic culture. Communication style is way different. Germans tend to have even more direct communication style than Americans do. They tend to say what's on their minds very directly. Facts are very important for for Germans. They're not so concerned with being polite. It's more important to be honest from a German perspective. The book points out that this compartmentalization is typical of German society. I would agree that there's this saying, Ordnung muss sein, there must be order. So Germans want order in all things. So they want things to be set out very clearly, so there should be clear differences, for example, between people in terms of your friends and your co-workers. So that's reflected in the language with the formal you sie and the informal you du, which is obviously not unique to German. A lot of countries have that as well. But it's reflected in other aspects of German life, this compartmentalization. They like to close off things, so doors are often closed at businesses. That indicates that people are seriously working and they need to concentrate. And there are a couple of other things that are interesting in terms of German management. The fact that leadership positions are awarded to people who have proven themselves. More so in other cultures, sometimes leadership positions are given to people because of their family background or their academic degrees. In Germany, they look at what you're able to do. And one of the things that's different in Germany in terms of the workforce is that they have a very well-established and long-established apprenticeship system. So it works much better, I think, in Germany than it does in a lot of other countries in terms of developing skilled workers. And it's one of the reasons why German products tend to be of a very high quality. We're going to watch a short clip that illustrates some German business etiquette.
It appears as though he's running a little bit late and didn't plan ahead to give himself enough time to make it to the meeting. At least he remembered to spit his gum out. A little bit of a slip there on the steps. Now folks, it's always good to be prepared, unlike Matt here. It looks like he's struggling to even find out where his meeting is.
Mensch, wo bleibt der Kerl eigentlich? Das geht mir jetzt schon wieder auf die Nerven. Der ist schon 5 Minuten spät.
Ich ruf mal an vorher,
ja,
oder?
das macht man überhaupt nicht. Das kann man nicht machen. Heilige Scheiße, was war das denn? Sorry, I'm late. My fault, though. Hi, I'm Matt Campbell.
Hi.
Nice meeting you.
Lieber Brustung, nice to meet you.
Dennis Wesselmann. Matt Campbell, pound it, hit it, twist it, bring it back, in one. Take a seat, please. Thank you so much for being here today. We're pretty excited to hear what you do.
I just gotta say, all business aside, I just gotta know, I'm a big David Hasselhoff fan. Do you guys like Knight Rider, or do you guys like Baywatch? I mean, me personally, I'm a big fan of the slow motion running scenes on the beach. I don't know with you guys.
I think we should start with the meeting. Let's go on and...
Okay.
Okay.
So some important points here. If you're in Germany, and this is true not only in business culture but in everyday life, Germans like to be punctual, and punctuality means being exactly on time, not even a few minutes late. It's how businesses are run. That's how the trains are run, buses, and so forth. Germans tend to be fairly formal, particularly in a business setting. So there's a difference distinction between Sie and Du, the formal, the informal mode of address. Germans, if you saw in that clip, the guy, the American, was trying to make jokes, make small talk. Germans like to get down to business. It's different than in other cultures, in Middle Eastern cultures, for example, where or in Latin America, where people like to get to know one another through small talk. Sometimes the case in the United States as well, but not in Germany so much. The other thing that's important is that Germans know their stuff. They expect you to know your stuff too. They are very dismissive of people who are not good at their jobs, and they're very honest about that. There's a saying in Germany that I think is very representative of German way of life. Dienst ist Dienst und Schnaps ist Schnaps. Dienst means work. So when you're at work, you work. When you're off work, you drink schnapps and beer. What's meant by that is that there's a sharp division between how you behave at your job and how you behave at home or out with friends. What that means in practical terms is if you're at work, you're supposed to be working. You're not supposed to be making personal phone calls, personal emails, and that's really an expectation for Germans. It's not the case that if you walk into even a place like McDonald's in Germany, United States, what happens in McDonald's? Well, the co-workers are talking about their boyfriends, their dates last night, and they may be paying attention to the customer and they may not be. You don't tend to see that so much in Germany. There tends to be the emphasis on really paying attention to what you're doing at work. On the other hand, when work is over, Germans play hard. They like to go out and drink and they like to socialize, but they make this pretty strict division between work and fun. One of the things that's different about German business culture, I think that's interesting, is knowing German, the language, is really not as important as knowing something about German cultural history. So most Germans, particularly that you'd encounter in a business setting, will speak English to varying degree, but they'll usually be able to communicate in English pretty well. What's really a plus is if you know something about classical music by German composers, if you know something about theater, movies, if you know something about, it would be great if you've read some books by German authors, if you're familiar with Goethe or Schiller or familiar with German philosophers, those can all be big pluses, really impress your German business partners. And so that's something that I think is different, kind of unique to German business culture. And once again, a very different culture here with Mexico. Mexico is very important to the United States. Germany is important as the largest economy in the European Union, and Mexico is very important as well, and the largest trading partner for the United States. Very different culture from Germany, a collectivistic culture where harmony is valued over individual rights. Work is seen very different in Mexico than in Germany. Germans assume, well, everybody works, that's the thing you do, and they don't really mind it. Mexicans see it as something you have to do and not something that that you want to do, but you have to earn the money. And the Mexican business culture is quite different in the sense that that positions, we were talking about that in relation to Germany, positions in Mexican companies can be acquired not necessarily through doing the best work, but who you know, where you come from, what your qualifications on paper are versus what you've actually achieved in demonstrable work at the company. One of the things that I would say Mexico and Germany have in common in terms of business culture is a kind of an adverse reaction to risk-taking. Germans tend to be fairly conservative. The same is true in Mexico. In that sense, it's very different than American corporate culture, where risk-taking is valued and, in fact, rewarded. We're going to watch a short clip about Mexican business etiquette.
Monica, could you tell us, when I meet somebody, how do I greet them? You know, do I shake hands? How do I address them?
Well, it is important to distinguish whether you are talking in business or having an informal conversation. For instance, when you are conducting business, it's important to the use of titles. It is very common, the practice of using the title of coming from the bachelor or the master's degree, also depending on the hierarchical status, director, Mr. Director, or the profession like doctor. In the case of women, it is very interesting to see that we keep or we remain with a maiden name, and when we get married, we use or adopt the husband's family name. For example, in my case, my maiden name is Monica Lopez, my husband's family name is Gonzalez. So my married name is Monica Lopez de Gonzalez. So it is important to keep in mind all these aspects as far as how do you address to people, no? Also, it is very important to ask for help when pronouncing names. For instance, in Spanish we have stronger sounds than the ones that we have in English. It is Jose and not Jose, for instance, or Jorge instead of Jorge. So if you keep in mind all those things, you can be very well accepted.
So people appreciate if you are aware of that and you pronounce things correctly and address them correctly with that.
A couple of things that are interesting there. Greetings depends on the context. It's different in that respect from Germany, where everybody greets the same, whether it's in a business context or on the street. Titles are important. That's something that's important in Germany and Europe generally, and Northern Europe in particular. But in Mexico, certainly one needs to be aware of that. One needs to get the name right. That includes for women. And pronounce the name correctly. One of the things that can be more important in Mexico than in Germany is knowing the native language, knowing Spanish. English skills tend to vary quite a bit in Mexico. The style of communication obviously is very different in Mexico than it is in Germany. Very emotionally expressive style, much more so than the United States. Personal distance is very different in Mexico. People, even in a business setting, will get very close, and it's not unusual for people to touch you on the shoulder or the arm. You shouldn't be backing away from that. You should maintain eye contact as well. Those are all things that are important in Mexican business etiquette. We're going to move on to China. I think Americans often assume, well, China, Japan, same thing, right? Well, they're very different. They have similarities, but they're very different in a couple of ways that we'll talk about. China is very important, obviously, from a business perspective, given the size of the country, the importance of China these days. And one of the things that's important in China, and this is something that has in common with Japan, is the importance of personal relationships in a business context. They really, in China, want to know who they're dealing with, and so they establishing a personal connection is very important. This is different than it is in the United States or in Germany. It's more typical of collectivistic cultures. And we're gonna in a minute talk about that a little bit more. But a couple of other things that are typical of business in China is that when there's conflict, the decisions are made by the executives and handed down for the most part. But when there is conflict over decisions that are made or other issues that might arise in a business setting, one of the things that's typically done in Asian cultures, including in China, is that a third party is brought in to mediate conflicts and to arrive at a compromise. there are very few, much fewer, many fewer lawsuits in China than there are in the United States. We tend to go to court pretty easily, and that's how we often deal with conflict. In Asian cultures, they prefer to try to find a solution through third-party negotiation, through mediation and compromise. Gift giving has traditionally been important in Chinese business culture, that you give gifts. It's kind of become a delicate issue because of bribery and corruption. Chinese government is trying to fight against that, so gift giving is a little trickier than it used to be. So we're going to watch a short clip about the importance of relationships in Chinese business.
关系 is a term central to the Chinese business culture that, simply put, means relationships or connections. Establishing these long-term, respect-based, and supportive relationships is the primary way to succeed in business within the society. Dress is generally conservative, so stick with subdued colors. Men are expected to wear jackets for meetings and dinners. Likewise, women should wear business suits, taking care to select blouses with high necklines and, to avoid being much taller than your host, shoes with little or no heel.
Mr. Johnson?
Hi.
Hi, Section Chief Yon will be pleased to know you're early. I'm Li Wen, his assistant.
It's nice to meet you. I'm Jack Johnson, and this is my boss, Chantel Edwards.
Oh, your boss?
The concept of 面子 is a very important part of the Chinese culture. Similar to the concept of respect, 面子 revolves around maintaining a good image, or face. If a person makes a mistake or is humiliated, they experience a loss of face.
Mrs. Edwards, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to assume.
It's no problem. I understand.
Thank you. Welcome. And Section Chief Yon will meet us outside the conference room. Please follow me.
谢谢.
So from the Chinese perspective, they like to get to know you. They expect that relationship to be a long-term relationship. It's important to be aware of Chinese practices in terms of etiquette and politeness. One of the things that's different in China as opposed to Japan is you don't bow. You shake somebody's hand. Maintaining face is very important. What happened in that clip was that the Chinese woman should have greeted the boss first instead of the interpreter, but she didn't realize that that was the boss, and she lost face as a result. And the American woman did the right thing and said and helped her maintain face by saying, "Oh, it's okay, it doesn't matter at all." She, you may have noticed at the end, she said "xie xie," which is thank you in Chinese. That's very helpful if you can learn a few phrases of Chinese. Chinese don't expect you to have learned Mandarin. They'd be very surprised if you speak any Mandarin at all, but they do appreciate the effort to learn a few phrases as a sign of respect. And the last culture they're going to talk about is the Middle East. This is becoming a very important culture. It's very important politically to us. It's obviously situation with the Middle East, with Arabic countries, that there's been a lot of tension after 9/11. One of the problems when doing business with Middle Eastern countries is typically Americans don't know much about the Middle East. They don't speak Arabic. They don't. It's a different religion. It's a different culture altogether. It's much easier to do business in Western Europe. But Asia and Middle East are very foreign in a lot of ways to American businesses. One of the other practical issues with doing business in the Middle East is the political volatility. A lot of countries, there's a lot of difference among countries in terms of political systems. So because of the Arab Spring in 2011, we have new kinds of governments in a variety of Arabic countries. but in other countries you have very traditional kind of hierarchical governments still in place. You have a very large youth population, which is one of the things that's contributed to the political volatility in that part of the world. I'm going to hear briefly about Middle Eastern business practices, and we'll talk about that.
We believe as Americans that the Arab world is monolithic, but it is very different. It's different culturally. There are nuances between the different cultures. From somebody, for instance, who is from Morocco or from Tunisia versus somebody that's from Egypt or from Saudi Arabia or any of the Emirates. There are differences in terms of dialect, in terms of just cultures. There are lots of similarities in terms of the language, which is Arabic, and also the religious beliefs. About 85% of people in the Arab world are Muslims, and there is a definite impact of the religion in that part of the world, plus in terms of business dealing. So part of the course that we're going to be covering is an understanding of the impact of the religious practices on the businesses.
Give me an example of how that, how the religious side might impact the business side.
One of the examples will be Fridays is a holiday for Muslims. That's when the congregational prayers are. Another example would be, and most people do not work. I mean, that's a holiday. They don't work on Fridays. Another would be maybe in a meeting. It's the call for prayer. And partners who happen to be Arabs and Muslims and practice their religion might just say, excuse me, for 5 minutes, and they just kind of disappear. For a person that doesn't understand what just took place, they might be very puzzled, but if they know it's time for prayer and the people have left to do their prayer, then they will be more likely to understand and be able to communicate better with their counterparts in the Arab world.
What about the sense of time and the sense of meetings and things like that? Is there a difference in that regard?
Absolutely. As Americans, we are very much on fixed time versus the Arab world, which is more on the fluid time basis, and that can be aggravating. And one of the competencies or the skills that folks who are going to be traveling and doing business in the Arab world is they have to be really patient and resilient and not take that as personally. So that's a definite something to look out for. And in the class, we'll be looking at ways to deal with that situation.
And something that we were talking about a little bit earlier is the focus on the collective rather than the individual. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that dynamic plays itself out in business dealings in the Arab world?
As Americans, we're always concerned about the individual. It's me and what am I able to accomplish. In the Arab world, it's different. It's about the family, it's about the company, it's about the group, and people pick not necessarily what's best for them, but what's best for the group, whether it's the family or the company or the organization. So that is definitely something that's different. And as an American going overseas to the Arab world and talking about me and my accomplishment, that would not be necessarily looked very favorably upon. And in the same token, as an American going and doing business in the Arab world, by listening and hearing about people as groups versus an individual, we might say, what's the matter with that person? So it's to raise the awareness of that cultural gap and how to very much widen our reception and not necessarily looking at different things through our own cultural lens, but through a wider lens.
So some do's and don'ts. Be aware of the fact that not all countries are the same. If you take, for example, Morocco in northern Africa and Indonesia and Saudi Arabia, those are all Islamic countries, but they're very different. Even cultures like Morocco and Saudi Arabia, where Arabic is spoken, and have a lot of similarities in terms of cultural history and culture in general. They're very, very sharp differences in terms of everyday culture. For example, how women are treated, how women's rights, and a lot of other differences among those countries. So one shouldn't assume they're all the same. Some knowledge of Islam, as was pointed out there in that clip, is important. Knowing how to greet people, how to deal with women in Middle Eastern countries is also very important. And this is a result of a survey that was done in terms of how Arab business managers view Americans. It's not very positive. They kind of see Americans as not being able to adjust to different cultures, and I think in terms of how American businesses have done have carried on businesses in the Middle East, that's pretty much the case. So that's the end of this presentation for Chapter 11.